All right. Welcome everybody to our talk, All Cops Are Broadcasting, Breaking TETRA After Decades in the Shadows. We're very excited to be able to present this research after more than a year and a half of disclosure embargo. My name is Wetzels, and these are my colleagues, Meijer and Meijer Bokslag. And together we form Midnight Blue, a specialist security consultancy company from the Netherlands. We specialize in research mainly in critical infrastructure and embedded systems. And you may know us of prior research into BlackBerry QNX, the Meijer classic RFID cipher, and car immobilizer security. So what is TETRA? TETRA is a globally used radio standard that competes with the likes of P25, DMR, and Tetrapol. It was standardized in 1995 by ETSI, the European Telecommunication Standards Institute, who are also known for doing the standardization of GSM, 3G, 4G, and so on. And it's used for voice and data communications, including machine-to-machine. And what's interesting is that it relies on secret proprietary cryptography, which is why we're standing here today. So the major use case of TETRA is it's used by police forces. The vast majority of police forces in the world use TETRA technology, including in Europe, parts of Asia, and Latin America, including here in Argentina. Now be aware that the maps we show you here are just what we could confirm through open source intelligence, so there may be more users out there. It's also used in military and intelligence contexts, either in an active military context or as a base protection system. And it's used a lot in critical infrastructure. Many parties, such as airports, harbors, and train stations, use TETRA for voice communications, for private security, but also as a SCADA wide area network for substation and pipeline control and railway signaling in the countries that you can see on this slide. Now, a common misconception is that TETRA is an open standard. That's not actually true. It's a public standard, but the cryptography is kept secret. It's only available under a non-disclosure agreement that's only available to bona fide parties. And once you sign the non-disclosure agreement, you can't talk about the standard anymore. And manufacturers of this equipment have to protect the algorithms that are in there, either by implementing them in hardware or implementing them in software with extra software extraction countermeasures. The first problem is that there are a lot of bona fide vendors, and they're dispersed among many geographic players. Every major country has a vendor, whether it's the United States or Denmark or Germany or China or Russia. So top-tier adversaries already have these specifications through their in-country manufacturers or just pulling them off a SharePoint somewhere. TETRA security has two main pillars, the first of which is the TAA1 suite. That's the Authentication suite that takes care of network authentication, key management and distribution, as well as identity encryption. And then the second part is the TEA suite, which is the TETRA encryption algorithm suite for voice and data encryption. And this is divided in 4 proprietary algorithms, TEA1 to TEA4, of which TEA1 and TEA4 are readily exportable outside of the European Union. TEA2, which is meant for use by European public safety organizations, and TEA3, which is meant for those public safety organizations outside of the European Union, but which have good geopolitical relationships with the European Union. Optionally, it's possible to have an end-to-end solution bolted on top of that. Now, this is only used by some countries, usually in very special cases like special forces and parts of the intelligence services. It's not part of the TETRA standard itself. There are some guidelines available and integrations, but that's it. It's proprietary and it's bolted on top of the air interface encryption. It's, again, very opaque. So, this leads us to the project we undertook, Project ReTETRA. We undertook this on the basis of Kerckhoffs's principle. I probably don't have to explain it to you, but I'm going to anyway. Kerckhoffs's principle says that a crypto system should be secure even if everything about the system, except for the key, is public knowledge. So no security through obscurity, right? Why? Because historically violators of this principle have not fared well. If you look at the history of these standards with secret crypto algorithms, whether it's GSM, satellite phones, GPRS, or whatever, all ETSI standards, by the way, it turns out that these proprietary algorithms either turned out to be very weak or backdoored. So we were suspicious that TETRA might be similar. Now, Etsy thinks differently about this. In an interview with Brian Murgatroyd, who is the chairman of the Etsy Technical Committee on TETRA, with a journalist, he said, well, obscurity is also a way of maintaining security. So let's see if that's actually the case. With that in mind, we undertook the TETRA project. Our goal was to open up the standard for public for the first time after 20+ years and enable people to make an informed risk analysis. And with that, I hand the word to my colleague, Wouter.
Thank you. Yeah, so as Jos pointed out, we wanted to investigate the security of TETRA without being bound by NDAs. So we decided that we would get a radio, reverse engineer the radio, get the algorithms out there, analyze them, and publish our results. So the first thing we did is analyze the landscape. Which vendors are there? Which models do they have? There is a lot of choice, and it's important to pick the right research target. Picking the wrong one, you might meet a dead end and waste a lot of time. So we picked a radio, and then we started analyzing the firmware, identify where the ciphers are implemented inside this radio. Once we found that, we devised multiple 0 days in order to be able to exploit the radio and get the crypto out of there. And then finally, we could do what we actually came for, and that is analyze the TETRA cryptographic primitives. So it's a long story, but I'll boil it down to a single slide for you. What you see here is an overview of the SoC that's used in our MTM 5400 radio. It consists of 2 cores, an ARM core application processor and a DSP, a digital signal processor that does modulation stuff. And the DSP also has a trusted execution environment. And this is a piece of a feature in which the secret algorithms are loaded in an encrypted form and then made available for use by less trusted code from the DSP. So what we did is we exploited a format string vulnerability that was exposed through the AT modem command interface on the rear of the radio. We got code execution on the ARM processor. We then pivoted to the DSP because there are shared memory regions that were not protected, so we could easily just overwrite DSP code, get our code to run there. And then we identified and exploited a cache timing side channel on the trusted execution environment. So we got out the algorithms, we reverse engineered them. More details about this process can be found in our DevCon talk that's now online, but let's move on and discuss what we actually found in terms of TETRA cryptographic primitives. So, what you see here is a depiction as it would be in the standard. This is the mutual authentication between a mobile station and the infrastructure. So there is some random numbers, there's some key material, and then there is these boxes that are the secret primitives. And now that we have uncovered how these things actually work, we can make some more observations. What we found is that all the primitives that are called TA, something, are based on a Feistel cipher called Hurdle. 16 rounds, it uses 64-bit blocks and a 128-bit key. And all the blocks that are labeled TB are really simple functions only based on some XOR and maybe an addition or something. And also interesting is that we found that some of the blocks are maybe named differently, but are very related. And that brings us to the first attack we will discuss here, a DCK pinning attack. The DCK is a session key. Once again, we see the authentication procedure here. K is a secret that is shared between the radio and the infrastructure. And through a mutual authentication, they attest that they are talking with a legitimate, the legitimate MS and the legitimate infrastructure. And also, through the TB4 function, the DCK session key is derived. Now, if you write this thing down, you would get a formula for computing the DCK that depends on a few of these functions. And now that we know how these primitives work, we can simplify this a little bit. So TA21 turns out to be identical to TA11, except that it uses a random seed in a reverse byte order. TA22 is identical to TA12, and the TB4 function is just a XOR of the 2 keys that are put in to finally make the session key. And given that, we can mount an attack. imagine we impersonate the infrastructure and we target a mobile radio. We can provide the radio with a RS, so the random seed, which has the following feature. It is a palindrome. So if you reverse the byte order, it will be identical. And if we are then able to predict the random number that a mobile station will generate, then we have a vulnerable situation. And prediction of a random number may seem like a bit of a stretch, but in embedded systems, it's pretty hard to do secure random number generation. So this is actually more common than you might think. And what we end up with is a further simplification of the formula that derives the session key, in which we have a XOR over twice the same number. And as you may know, due to the nature of XOR, that will always result in 0. So without knowing the secret that underpins this authentication, we have now ended up with an authenticated session with a mobile station with an all-0 key. Next thing we will discuss is identity encryption. Identity encryption is implemented in a primitive called TA61, and it is used to encrypt these 24-bit TETRA addresses that you may compare to a phone number. And it's not real anonymity because these encrypted addresses don't change very often, but at least you will not just see someone's phone number fly over the air, which makes it very easy to identify who is talking to who. At this point, we cannot disclose the implementation of TA61 due to some serious concerns from stakeholders, but we will do that in December. So if you're interested, stay tuned. And what we will publish is the attack so that we can have an informed discussion on this. So TA61 uses the CCK, which is a central network key used in TETRA, and it uses Hurdle to compress that into what we call an intermediate secret, shown here as C, which is a 64-bit secret, which is then only used in the encryption process of the identity. So you see that the identity gets combined with this intermediate secret and some function, and then we end up with an encrypted identity. Now, this is vulnerable to a meet-in-the-middle attack, because what we can do is obtain somehow 3 encrypted identities together with their unencrypted equivalent identity, and then start computing forward from the unencrypted one, compute backwards from the encrypted one, and see what fits in the middle. This attack runs in about a minute on a laptop. So, depending on the use case of your TETRA network, that might not be a big deal, but it could also be quite devastating, because TETRA identities are generally distributed in blocks. So you could have that, for instance, address 0 to 100 is used by police, while 100 to 200 is used by the intervention teams, 200 to 300 by firefighters or something. So if an attacker would invest some effort into identifying which ranges belong to which kind of use, then you can quite easily detect which kinds of TETRA users are in your vicinity. This can be useful for counterintelligence purposes, or provide a criminal with an early warning if large amounts of intervention team radios start piling up in the area. The attack is fully passive, so it cannot be detected, and you can run it on very, very cheap hardware. Right, now let's talk about the actual encryption in TETRA. As Jos pointed out, TETRA features different key stream generator algorithms, and we found that they all look a lot like each other. Shown here is TEA2, used for European law enforcement. And this structure with the key register separated from the state register, which then starts outputting key stream, is identical for all of the algorithms. We have taken a look at TEA2, and to us it seems robust. Must be said, we are not cryptographers, so further research is necessary in order to make sure that this is actually fit for purpose. But it gets really serious once you start looking at TA1. Remember, TA1 is used by all commercial applications and also used by police and military forces from countries that are not on very good footing with the EU. And the first thing TEA1 does is take this 80-bit key and compress it into a 32-bit reduced key. And it will then only use this reduced key for the generation of key stream with which messages are encrypted. Obviously, this is trivial to brute force on a laptop, takes less than a minute, and it allows an attacker to intercept communications and decrypt them, but you could also partake in the communication, so you could inject data. And that is particularly worrisome when TETRA is used in a data carrying capacity, for instance, for SCADA telecontrol traffic. So let's go for a demonstration. Video on top.
The second demonstration shows how to decrypt communications of a Tier 1 encrypted network, commonly used by critical infrastructure and commercial parties.
This should have been confidential.
The demonstration is carried out by us on a real network. The attacker captures traffic and identifies messages on which to mount the attack. Now the attacker computes the key used on this frequency. This takes about a minute. The attacker can now decrypt all traffic or partake in voice or data communication.
This should have been confidential.
Technical details follow on August 9th.
All right. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So that's pretty serious, right? Now, focus. Thanks. Now, what was Etsy's response? In the interview that was cited by Jos previously, they made some statements, and one of the statements was that we were using very high-powered graphics cards in order to carry out the attack. Well, you have seen me do this on my laptop. I also used a 2016 consumer-grade graphics card for this. So, yeah, that's a weird thing to say. Also, he said that 25 years ago, 32 bits of key entropy might have been sufficient, and that someone would need some pretty reasonable equipment in order to be able to carry out these attacks. So I don't think I need to point it out to you that this is nonsense, but there's probably something better to be done, and that is not make any assumptions and not use reasonable equipment, but just see what this bad boy can do.
Hi, we're Midnight Blue. About 2 weeks ago, we announced the TETRA burst vulnerabilities, consisting of 5 vulnerabilities in the TETRA radio standard, 2 of which are deemed critical. Since then, Etsy, the standardization body responsible for TETRA, has made public statements in which they downplay the seriousness of the vulnerabilities. In these statements, they resorted to a semantic discussion, not calling a spade, or more specifically, not calling a backdoor a backdoor. Furthermore, they made a number of evidently false statements, such as claiming packet injection in TEA1 encrypted networks would be impossible, and that 32 bits of cryptographic strength would have been sufficient in the late 90s. To any information security expert, it's pretty clear that this is not the case. But to help remove those few remaining doubts, we decided to take on the challenge of cracking TEA1 on this beautiful machine produced in 1998, running good old Windows 95. Frankly, the hardware is so old that it wasn't easy to get our hands on. When we run the cracking tool, we see it reports that it needs about 13 hours to go through the entire search space. After 12.5 hours, the key is found, demonstrating the feasibility of cracking TEA1 on 90s consumer hardware. Alright Etsy, now that we've cleared up this issue, please let us know if you'd like us to demonstrate packet injection as well.
All right, now that we got that out of the way, there is another issue that we found that concerns protocol level design. You can say like TA1, right? That's supposed to be weak. Now this is kind of a big deal because this also concerns any other cipher. We didn't break the actual cipher, but we took a look at how the cipher is being used within the system, and that turned out to be vulnerable. So what you get here is, what you see on the slide, is a packet that comes down from the tower. It's a signaling packet. It starts with a MAC header, which is unencrypted. It contains all kinds of stuff, like, for example, an address, so the mobile station knows whether this packet is intended for it. Also a bit, it's stating that it's encrypted. From the MAC header onward, you have this LLC header, which is encrypted. And what's important to realize here is that TETRA messages don't have any cryptographic authentication or integrity guarantees. There's checksums on the lower layer MAC and optionally on the LLC layer, but the key stream is completely malleable, so there's no MAC whatsoever. Right. Now the way the key stream generator works is they're fed a combination with a key and some fresh data. Otherwise, if you didn't put in the second ingredient, you would get the same key stream every time, and that would be a problem. So what they do in this case, they build an initialization vector. In this case, the initialization vector is based on frame counters. You can view this as sort of a timestamp that's for the network as a whole. So what you get is like you have a direction bit, like is this message coming down from the tower or is it going up? There's a hyperframe, multi-frame, frame, and slot number. These are just incrementing counters, just to make sure that every time the keystream function is invoked, it outputs fresh data. Now, by the way, these numbers, how is a radio supposed to know which number to use? Well, the thing is, it gets it from the network tower in sync and sysfl frames. The thing is, those are broadcast unencrypted and in unauthenticated fashion. So they're just taken from the air, taken as face value, and if the numbers that are in these packets differ from what the radio is expecting, it will just take over whatever it got from the air. All right, so how would an attack be based? How would you base an attack on this? Well, suppose that you're an attacker. You can overpower the signal, for example, by just putting more transmit power in there, or use directional antennas, or just being closer to your target, or a combination of any of those. And then you tell the radio, hey, the time is now this, by sending spoofed sync and sysfl frames. And the radio will then be tricked in using the key stream that was generated at that time, whatever time you choose. So again, this works regardless of which TEA cipher is used. So this also works on European police and intelligence, what have you. Right, so an attack would look something like this. You grab a message from the air, and that's encrypted, and you'd like to look into it. So you just you go to a police station or a military base or what have you, and you grab that message, and you decide at a later point in time that you want to decrypt that. You can go back to the same police station, but you can also go to any other location, doesn't matter. Like, as long as the target radio that you pick shares the key information that was used to encrypt the message in the first place, then you overpower the signal towards the target radio. And then you set the time to time t, which is the time where the original message that you're interested in was captured. And then you do some sort of a mating dance. We'll get into this later. You provoke this target device into exfiltration of the key stream that you're interested in, and then you can decrypt the message. Right, so how would you do that? Well, first we're going to assume that we already have, say, n bits of key stream. And I'm now going to explain how you, from this n bits of key stream, you do a little dance and you get n+1 bits of key stream. You can repeat this attack over and over again until you get the entire key stream that you want. So suppose that you already have n bits. You then craft a message of length n+1. and you choose an opcode that provokes the device to acknowledge the message. So whenever the message is received and decrypted in good order, it will send an acknowledgement message. And also, it's crucial, that's the thing, this message has a checksum, an FCS, frame check sequence. So what you then get is you send this message to the MS, you encrypt it with the key stream of n bits, and you append a 0 bit to the key stream that you don't have. And you send it, and then the mobile station will either acknowledge the packet that you just sent, or it will drop it, depending on whether your key stream bit was correct or not. Because if the key stream was wrong, then the checksum after decryption will be wrong, and therefore the thing will be dropped. In either case, you learn a key stream bit, and then you can repeat it over and over again. Right. So still, we need n bits of key stream, right? So how we go about this? Well, we call this a seed key stream. So what you can do is you send 16 messages, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, etc., etc. And it turns out that exactly one of these messages will get acknowledged by your target radio. That's because the opcode that you sent this message for demands, it's standardized that it's supposed to be acknowledged. So then you learn 4 bits of key stream. Now, 4 bits isn't enough, but you can do this several times for consecutive frames. And by doing so, you can have, let's say you recover 10 of these 4 bits of key stream fragments. You need 37 bits at least for the attack that I showed you earlier with the n number of key stream bits. So what you do, suppose that you have 4-bit key stream fragments, and you have 10 of those in consecutive order. Then you can use MAC fragmentation functionality to stitch those together. So then you can repeat the attack that I explained to you earlier by just stitching them together. The radio will then glue these back together. It will check the checksum, and if it checks out, it will acknowledge the message. And this way, you can repeat the attack in the same fashion as before, just that you layer it on top over 10 different keystream fragments rather than just a single one. But this works regardless, and you can choose which of these 10 fragments you'd like to extend in terms of length. So that basically means that you can now recover arbitrary keystream for whatever message you get. So that means you can recover any message. Right. Etsy also had something to say about this. When we presented it to them, they said it was a nice theoretical attack, but it's not practical. You haven't demonstrated a thing yet, and there's so many things that can probably mess things up. So we were like, okay, how about you provide us with a base station so we can implement the attack in practice and see what happens? And they say, yeah, no. Right. So a lot of stakeholders, they were bound to like strict rules with their manufacturers and stuff. So they also responded in a similar way. But we weren't going to give up just yet. So what do we do now? So one option that we have is like implement our own TETRA stack. And we tend to also do fun things in life, and this is not particularly fun, and it's also like it's sort of an insane amount of work. So what we then decided to do is we just bought a base station off eBay. Clearly, this is a thing. And we found some vulnerabilities in it. We wrote a module loading framework in it, and then we used this puppy as an attack platform in order to attack our target radio. And that looks a little bit like this.
Hi, we are Midnight Blue. We have uncovered several serious vulnerabilities in the TETRA radio standard, .TETRA burst. We will first demonstrate a decryption oracle attack to recover a text message, but the attack can also be applied to voice communication and data. The demonstration takes place on our lab setup. The radio receives an encrypted message, which is also captured by the attacker. We see the message says secret. The attacker now needs to target a radio and impersonate the infrastructure and carry out the attack to decrypt the previously captured message. We have sped up this process. The attacker has now recovered all he needs to decrypt the message. This attack applies to all TETRA configurations, but can be resolved with a firmware update. Further details will be disclosed on August 9th.
All right. Well, we thought this would be kind of a big deal, you know, like we can basically pick and choose a message, grab it from the air and use this attack. Well, it's an active attack, it's cumbersome, but still we can just basically decrypt everything, including stuff that's supposed to be for European law enforcement and what have you. Etsy also had something to say about this. The research uncovered some general areas for improvement for the TETRA protocol. So that's pretty much all they had to say about this attack. So yeah, I mean, sure. Right. There's a third TIA algorithm, TEA3, which is intended for public safety in non-European countries with friendly relations with the EU, of course. It didn't seem trivially weak to us, but it has suspicious quirk. So the S-box, if that tells you anything. It's a lookup table, and it's supposed to be a permutation, so every entry should be unique, and it turns out it's not. So two entries actually have the same value. Now what you get with this is that if you flip one of those, one bit in one of those values, you get a proper S-box again. So that's really weird. We triple checked that this is not an artifact of the way we extracted the firmwares and stuff. This is the way TIA3 is supposed to be. So there's another thing. So like if you're into cryptography, this will immediately raise some red flags. Like for example, things called state mergers. Those are again mitigated, which is not the case in all the other TEA algorithms, by XORing in another state byte, which is interesting because that's a unique property for TEA3. So overall, this is highly suspicious, highly unusual, and it's definitely not designed to be a positive. That's all we can say for now. Right, so that brings us to the coordinated vulnerability disclosure we undertook.
All right, thank you for that. So, we started work on this project in January of 2021, as you can see on the top of the slide. And at the end of the year, we first contacted the Dutch National Cybersecurity Center. In January of 2022, we had our first meetings with the Dutch police, with Etsy, the standards body, as well as the intelligence community to distribute our initial findings. And in February of that year, we had a preliminary advisory that was put out to all certs around the world through the NCSC. Throughout the years of 2022 and 2023, we put out further advisory information and mitigations that were distributed to stakeholders and coordinated a publication timeline. Because as you can imagine, this stuff is very sensitive, and typically for embedded systems, there's a lifetime of 6 months of disclosure. We chose to make that longer to give everybody the proper amount of time to mitigate these kind of issues while finding a balance with informing everybody. Now, when it comes to mitigations, the keystream recovery attack can be mitigated with firmware updates. It has to be said that assumes they work properly. More about that later. As well as end-to-end encryption solutions, which can be bolted on top of the air interface encryption, again with the caveat that these are proprietary solutions as well that nobody has looked into publicly yet. The TEA1 backdoor can only be mitigated through migrating to a different cipher, for example, TEA2. That has to be said, you have to be able to get TEA2. And the de-anonymization attack requires migrating to the new updated standard. So currently there's no real fix for that, except for adjusting your operational security measures. So a word of warning, as we went through this disclosure process and after our initial public disclosures, we heard stories that not all vendors have been properly informing their customers. As of October this year, we have received multiple reports of vendors continuing to recommend the backdoored algorithm TEA1, falsely claiming that it can be patched without migration or downplay the impact of the TETRA burst vulnerabilities. Altogether, we have also received reports of incomplete patches being pushed out, leaving risks unaddressed. And if you are not aware of this as an asset owner, you might think you've solved some issues while you've not. We are investigating other potential issues related, for example, to message injection. So please, if you have any issues or are you running a TETRA network, feel free to reach out to us when in doubt about the particular impact. Now, a little bit about the aftermath. So, in the interview with the journalists Kim Zetter and Brian Murgatroyd, the chair of the ETSI Technical Commission on TETRA, he said a couple of interesting things. He said, I would expect that anybody who would need a lot of protection would not just be using TEA1. Within Europe, I would suggest that anyone who needed high security would be using TEA2. That's interesting because we did some digging through open source intelligence. We looked through tenders, RFPs, and procurement documents showing that in the last 5 years, TEA1 equipment was procured for police and military agencies in countries like Poland, Bulgaria, Croatia, and Montenegro and Moldova, all of which are either European Union states or candidate European Union states. So these received in the last 5 years backdoored equipment. Now, maybe none of this matters. Maybe none of this stuff that we looked at, is relevant because the chairman said, well, there's no evidence of any attacks on TETRA that we know of. And in their official statement, they said, ETSI and TCCA are not aware of any exploitations on operational networks. Well, that's interesting because 2 out of 5 attacks are passive. So how are you going to notice if there's active exploitation? But we did some more digging, and we looked through the Snowden documents. And as you can see on these documents, the Snowden leaks show a joint NSA and Australian Signals Directorate project to collect Indonesian police TETRA communications during the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali in 2007, where they mentioned that they got collections on the Bali Chief of Police private phone number as well as demonstration routes. Now, this is not a proof that they exploited our direct vulnerabilities, but it shows that they are exploiting TETRA networks. And also quite relevant to Argentina, where we're standing today, the Snowden leaks revealed that GCHQ, which is the British Signals Intelligence Service, undertook an effects operation called Operation Keto against Argentina around the conflict with the Malvinas, around oil exploration rights tensions in 2009, where they mentioned that they collected TETRA communications as part of tasking around high-priority military and leadership comms. So we don't know if they exploited these vulnerabilities, but they were targeting TETRA networks, so at least this is hard evidence. So what's next? ETSI announced an update to the standard. They're going to roll out new algorithms. Initially, they said, well, we're going to roll out new algorithms, but we're going to keep them secret again. And then the journalist asked, well, if the only reason you're keeping them secret is because the government has advised it, can ETSI decide to make these algorithms public? And then the chairman said, well, I'd have to say yes. And the journalist said, well, why don't you? And the answer was, well, I don't know. So, should we trust the new algorithms, and particularly TEA6 and 7, which will be the exportable ones? What do you guys think? No. Well, let's just ask ETSI. In the interview, they said, should we trust the ETSI algorithms going forward? And then, the chairman says, well, you can trust it because we have no reason to produce dodgy algorithms, if you like, except for the dodgy ones that they produced. And then a little bit later in the interview, they said, well, the algorithms were designed with some assistance from some government authorities, let me put it that way, which is always very confidence-inspiring. And finally, they said, well, at the end of the day, it's down to the customer organization to ensure that things are secure enough for them. Now, I agree that's difficult with a private algorithm that you can't look into, but the reason we have 3 different algorithms available must make it clear to somebody that they're not all as secure as each other. So you're going to get 3 new algorithms, so you can make up your mind about that one. A new development is that there might be a tiny glimmer of hope. Recently, the journalist Kim Zetter revealed that apparently Etsy is considering making the new TETRA algorithms public as a result of our research. Whether that's actually going to happen, we don't know for sure yet, but it might happen. And we want to add the caveat that assuming that they will be fully public, and that means that not only the algorithms are public, but the design criteria, the unexplained constants, any closed vendor reference implementations, everything needs to be public. If that is the case, we would consider this to be a very welcome victory. And finally, in conclusion, this research has been the first public in-depth TETRA security analysis after more than 20 years in the shadows. Secret cryptography algorithms were reverse engineered. More than 100 countries and many different critical sectors are affected. We found multiple 0 days, including a backdoored algorithm. Patches are available for some of the issues, mitigations for others, but there's lots of work still to be done for asset owners in rolling this out and checking whether they're affected and how they are affected. So I'd like to end on a call to action. If your organization uses TETRA, or you think you might be using TETRA, or you know someone who uses TETRA, look into the relevant mitigations. Don't blindly trust the advisories that you get from your vendors. Reach out to us if you have any doubts. For those who are into cryptography, take a closer look at those algorithms that we haven't looked at yet in depth. The TEA2 algorithm, maybe the S-box of TEA3, and so on. If you're a software developer, there's great work in the open TETRA stacks done by Osmocom, for example. There's still lots to do, so reach out to the NLNet Foundation, which sponsored our research. They have money available for you to work on this stuff. And finally, please stop doing secret cryptography. Don't do it. It's a bad idea, and it's not good table manners. So, finally, if you have any questions, I'd like to take them now, or you can walk up to us after our talk and ask them in private. And that's that. I see someone waving their hand there. Yeah, you.
Thank you. So I have two quick questions. The keystream recovery attack, it seems like a variation of the Blakenbacker attack from 1998. When was the protocol specification done? That's question number one. And question number two is, the city of Buenos Aires uses TETRA. Do you know which encryption algorithm they use?
Well, that's very interesting. Answer for your first question, the algorithm specifications were first published officially in 1995. I think some prior work was done, you know, in the early 90s, the broad early 90s. So at the time that this standard came out, when the vendors were still building the hardware, this was already a feasible attack on TEA1, and that has to be added by consumer hardware at the time. So not just by governments, by consumer hardware. So even as a backdoor, if you agree with backdoors, then it's still a bad idea. When it comes to the city of Buenos Aires, I know TETRA is used a lot in Latin America, especially for the police, but also a lot in railroads, for example, and critical infrastructure in oil and gas. I don't know exactly what algorithm they use. We've put out our advisories through the Dutch National Cybersecurity Center, but I'd love to get in touch with someone responsible for those networks. So if you know someone, hook them up with us and we can see if we can help out. Any other questions? Maybe just to add to your last question, if they use an algorithm, it has to be TEA1 or 3. So it's either the fully backdoored one or the sketchy one.
Okay.
Any other takers?
Bueno, le damos un fuerte aplauso.
All right, thank you.
Y no se vayan porque en 5 minutos continuamos con la última charla.